All right, you're on.
Okay, last week we studied how the nation of Israel, after 13 months of being away from Egypt and spending time at the base of Mount Sinai, was organized and prepared and started to march out from Mount Sinai towards the promised land. They were called to march as God's army by the trumpet call, and they were an organized assembly. And the way that they moved out, the way that they followed God's instructions really manifested their obedience to God. And the way they did it was a splendid procession that glorified God. The main message that we learned from last week's lesson was that God orders the steps of his people, leading them to righteousness and toward the fulfillment of God's promises. However, God's people must remain faithful and obedient to be victorious and to receive God's blessings. This week, we're going to find ourselves asking the question, what happened? Because they left in obedience, they left purified, they left in a covenant relationship with God, and so quickly they fell back into their old ways. Chapter 11 of the book of Numbers and the chapters that follow are full of examples of how emotions and weakness of the hearts of God's people took control of their actions and caused them to sin against God. I titled this lesson tonight, When Our Emotions and Passions Bring Out the Worst in Us. And so we're going to see how what starts as a feeling or an emotion really can grow into being disobedient to God and sinful toward God's. We're going to also learn how God dealt with Israel's sinful rejection of his promises and his blessings. So we're going to look at how the people of Israel reacted after just being 3 days in the wilderness after leaving Mount Sinai. We're going to look how Moses reacted to his people and then how God dealt with them. You know, it kind of reminds me of if you ever watched the TV series Star Trek and Spock. And Spock was the logical one. He was devoid of human emotions or feelings. And you could always count on him to be rock steady because he would always do what was logical. And that was always contrasted with Kurt and all the other people that were in the cast who dealt with their problems emotionally. One of the themes of the whole Star Trek series is how human beings with their emotions are more complete than just a logical Spock who always made a logical decision without emotion. Well, we're going to kind of get into what are the bad points that emotion can take you down that road that causes you to sin against God. They are a fundamental part of our human nature, and it's with emotions of love and worship that we can glorify God. But our emotions can take control of us and cause us to sin against God. And we're going to look at some examples tonight. When we allow these emotions to take root and control our actions in a manner which causes us to sin against God, then our emotions will bring out the worst in us. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that as believers and followers of the Lord, we are called to walk in faith and trust in God's provision, power, and promises. When we allow our emotions and cravings, those are our strong desires, to override our faith and trust in God, we allow ourselves to rebel and we sin against God. So it's not the fact that we have emotions, it's when we allow those emotions to take away and destroy our trust and faith in God that causes us to sin and be disobedient to God. In the outline tonight, we're going to talk about how frustration against the hardships that the Israelites are experiencing in the wilderness caused the Israelites to complain. Then we're going to talk about how their craving for meat, the old life of Egypt, caused the Israelites to sin against God by complaining about the manna which God provided to them as daily bread. And then we're going to focus on Moses, how the depression and self-pity caused Moses to complain to God. And then we'll get into some interesting discussion questions and conclude with some applications and conclusions. So let's go with the study itself. And that is, we're going to start with the frustration against the hardships in the wilderness causes the Israelites to complain. So quickly, the Israelites lost sight of the promise of reaching the promised land. They started to complain about the hardships that they're experiencing at that moment. They had been encamped at Sinai and God had taken care of them, but it's a different thing to be encamped and get used to a location as opposed to moving and traveling and taking care of the people that are not able to travel as quick as the other ones. And quickly the people started to complain about their hardships in the wilderness. In Numbers, the very first verse of chapter 11, the scriptures tell us, now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. And when he heard them, his anger was aroused. We're going to see a difference between what God did in response to the Israelites after they left Egypt and started to complain, and what God does with his people after developing a covenant relationship with them and after they experienced how God provided for them over the past 13 months. So they, as I said before, they just began their journey into the wilderness from Mount Sinai. They'd only gone 3 days and already they're complaining. They were focusing on the circumstances they faced in the present, losing sight of where they were going to the promised land and what God promised that they would receive when they reached the promised land. You know, we can take a lot of hardship if we focus on the outcome. I can remember after getting out of the military and going to law school, I had to learn how to study all over again. I'm not sure after being in the Army, I even knew how to read and write. That first year of law school was one of the most difficult years that I ever had. And because I didn't have the opportunity to take the entrance exam, the bar exam to get into law school, they put me on probation. And probation in law school meant if you got a grade below a B, an average below a B, you didn't get promoted into the next level and you were kicked out of law school. Well, I took my first test in torts and I got a D minus. And I thought, boy, this, I may have to go back into the military. I'm not cut out for this. But I was told by one of my professors, keep sight of graduating from law school. Keep sight of your goal of becoming a lawyer and focus on that. Look forward, don't look back. And that did a lot of good because I studied harder. I was able to take the hardships and deprivations that go with spending 20 hours a day studying and doing outlines and reading the books and trying to learn how to do this all. And I was able to take the hardship because I looked towards the goal, towards the end state. The Israelites weren't doing that. The Israelites were focusing only on the present, on the hardships, on the circumstances they faced at the moment. And they started to complain. When you complain, God hears your complaints. He heard their complaints when they complained about their bondage and slavery in Egypt. And he sent Moses to lead them out of Egypt. God hears our complaints. But this time, as opposed to the time before when they complained in the wilderness, when they complained before, they complained about not having water. God instructed Moses to throw a stick in water and it became fresh so they could drink it, or to strike a rock and water came out of the rock. When they complained about food, God provided the manna on a daily basis. They didn't have to go out and hunt it down. It was right outside their tents. And they had enough for each person's needs each day. And on the sixth day, they gathered enough to take care of the seventh day. And we're going to go back to this manna tonight when God describes how nourishing and how good this food was for them. God didn't get angry at them when they left Egypt, but God is getting angry at them today. And the reason that God is getting angry is because God's saying, haven't you paid attention to what I've been doing for the past 13 months? providing for you, a cloud during the day to shelter you from the hot sun, manna that is a perfect nourishment for you, water, and I'm leading you to the promised land. And the people were complaining and God got angry. So what did God do? This time God responded to the complaints by causing a fire to burn on the outskirts of the Israeli camp. He didn't cause the fire to burn in the midst of the people, but on the outskirts. Numbers the second part of verse 1 of chapter 11, then fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The scriptures do not say that any Israeli lost his life. It just describes the fire. In God's mercy to his people, he restricted the fire to the outskirts. This is God showing his anger. And the people recognized that God is angry because they went to Moses and asked Moses to intercede and stop the fire. But God didn't really, this is like a warning shot, if anything, to the people of Israel, saying, you know, your complaints are being heard, and I'm not going to ignore it this time. I'm going to make you responsible for your complaints. The Israelites named this location Taberah, which translates as burning. And so the Israelites recognized the burning anger of God, the fire that God brought as a warning to their complaining. By acknowledging that their complaints caused God to show his displeasure, the Israels, as I said before, asked Moses to intercede on their behalf. In the second verse of chapter 11, the scriptures say, when the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord and the fire died down. God accepted their recognition that their complaints displeased him. Moses interceded and God responded by putting out the fire. And as I mentioned before, this is a little different response because we're not dealing with people that haven't had an experience with God in the wilderness for 13 months, and they've seen how God provides every detail of their lives. We also, when they left Egypt, they had not established the covenant relationship with God, but at Mount Sinai, they established that covenant relationship. They agreed to enter into the covenant relationship. And in that agreement, they agreed to be obedient to God's commands and to trust and rely upon the Lord. They so quickly they fell apart and didn't do that. So now we're going to get to the next stage. And we're going to see in the rest of this chapter and the chapters that follow, the increasing lack of trust, disobedience, and complaints of the people about their present circumstances, losing focus on God's promises. This time, it was a craving for meat, which caused the Israelites to sin against God by complaining about the manna which God provided to them as daily bread. In Numbers chapter 11, verses 4 and 5, the scriptures say, the rabble with them began to crave other food. And again, the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, onions, garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. Now they're complaining directly against something that the Lord provided them, which is the nourishment that kept them alive in the wilderness. But this time, the spirit of discontent started with the rabble. Most scholars interpret that as being those half Israelite, half Egyptian, or full Egyptian that departed from Egypt with the Israelites tagging along. And they started to complain about, we had it better in Egypt. And this discontent spread to the Israeli camp as a whole. And pretty soon this complaint spread all around. I can remember in the army, if you always had an NCO or somebody that started complaining, how contagious it was to the whole command. And so you had to nip it in the bud, and whoever was complaining, you had to take them aside and you had to get them to stop doing that. Or if they continued, you had to reassign them so they wouldn't contaminate the entire group. Again, instead of focusing on the blessings which God was already providing to them to nourish them, and instead of looking forward to the blessings which God promised to provide them in the future, the Israelites started to look back and rewrote their history. about how they were being treated in Egypt. They only looked at the good part. They had food, great. They forgot about the slavery, the bondage, the oppression of the slave masters, the fact that they had to build bricks and the hay was taken away from them. They forgot all that. And they forgot all the complaints they gave to God that were lifted up to God about their burdens in Egypt. And then they complain about the manna itself. In the middle of this chapter, God talks about this manna and how they could cook it a number of different ways and that it tasted like sweet honey. And it just completely provided for all their nourishment. It was really something that God specifically designed for the Israelites in the wilderness, and now that they're complaining about it. This craving, this word for craving is a word that really turns into a lust, an uncontrollable desire. And so this craving became something that overtook their logic or their understanding of what God was providing. This manna was their daily bread. The craving for meat and other foods caused the Israelites to yield to their craving and rebel against God. Instead of being thankful for what they had, the Israelites wanted to return to their former lives, hardening their hearts and rejecting the blessings which God was giving them in the wilderness. The true nature of the Israelites' complaint about not having meat was really their rejection of God and what God had been providing to them. God sent the manna as a test of their obedience appreciation, to test their appreciation of God's daily provision of what they needed to survive. Remember, the test part of it was they can only gather manna enough for one day, each person a daily portion, and only on the sixth day could they harvest a double portion. If they gathered more than they were allotted by the Lord, then it spoiled and they were disobedient to God. Whatever God in his sovereignty gives us or allows us to have is intended for our good. God knows what is good for us and what is not good for us. I remember in Fiddler on the Roof where Tevye was singing, "If I Were a Rich Man." Well, God doesn't make all of us rich with money. He gives us exactly what we need, our daily bread. And we have to learn to accept what God has given to us as a blessing to protect us basically from ourselves. And this is a good illustration of that in this part of the chapter of Numbers. The Israelites' complaint and distress about not having meat caused the Israelites to reject God's goodness. In response, God told Moses that he would send a surfeit of meat, so great in abundance that many of the Israelites would become ill and some would die. Speaking to Moses, God said, "Tell the people, consecrate yourself in preparation for tomorrow, when you will eat meat. The Lord heard when you wailed, 'If only we had meat to eat. We were better off in Egypt.' Now the Lord will give you meat and you will eat it. And you will not eat it for just 1 day or 2 days or 5 or 10 or 20 days, but for a whole month until it comes out your nostrils and you loathe it, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and have wailed before him saying, 'Why did we ever leave Egypt?'" God chose his people as to be a blessing, to take them to the promised land, and Israel in their rebellion and rejection of God's goodness. Now God was going to say, "Okay, you asked for it, you're going to get it." I can remember when I was married and we had, my wife was Hispanic and we had 8 kids in the house with their friends. And so we started serving them beans and they started complaining about beans. But I'll tell you, to feed maybe 12 people every day and not serve them beans as a staple was getting pretty expensive. So I said, if you're going to complain about beans, then beans is all you're going to get. And you're going to get beans until you stop complaining. And so we served them beans and it took about 3 weeks. No more complaints about beans. And then we gave them some other food. But boy, that sure worked. And this whole thing in the story of the Bible reminds me of that experience where they got beans up to their nostrils. By sending quail in response to the Israelites' sinful rejection of God's goodness, God allowed those who yielded to their cravings and who allowed their cravings to reject God to suffer the judgment and consequence from getting what they wanted, what they asked for. Isn't that something? Sometimes you get what you ask for and you find out it's not good for you. To many, the lustful craving turned into gluttony and resulted in death of those who yielded their sinful cravers to their sinful cravings and rejected God's goodness. In Numbers 11, chapter 11, verses 31 through 34, the scriptures describe the quail that God brought into the camp. Now a wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea, and it brought them down all around them to about 3 feet above the ground, as far as a day's walk in any direction. All that day and night, and all the next day, the people went out and gathered quail. No one gathered less than 10 homers. We're talking about 24 to 30 pounds of quail. Then they spread them out around the camp. But while the meat was still between their teeth and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. Therefore, the place was named Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved other food. Kibroth Hattaavah is translated graves of the craving. It is a sin to complain to God for failing to provide us with everything we think we need or we would like to have. In response to our sinful complaints against God for not providing what we think we deserve, God sometimes disciplines us by giving us what we ask for and allows us to face the consequences of not trusting God to provide what we need for our own good. And so this is amply illustrated. Now we're going to switch from the complaints of the people to Moses. And we're going to go to verses 10 through 15 in chapter 11. When Moses heard the complaint of the people about not having meat, he vented his frustration to God. Instead of interceding on behalf of the Israelites, Moses complained about the burdens and responsibilities which God had imposed upon him. Moses heard the people of every family wailing, each at the entrance to his tent. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. He asked the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you have put me, the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on oath to their forefathers? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me. Give us meat to eat. I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, put me to death right now. If I have found favor in your eyes, do not let my face my own ruin." Boy, Moses is suffering from self-pity, depression, and he's taking it all out on the Lord, complaining to the Lord. But he's turned to God. He's talking to God. And he's saying to God, I don't have the strength to keep doing this. The people are getting to me. Their wailing is getting to me, and I cannot provide. Well, do you think that God expected Moses to provide meat to several million people in the wilderness? In his frustration, weakness, and depression, Moses told God that death was preferable to dealing with the complaints of the people. There's a few pastors I've met in my lifetime that had gotten to the point of burnout with the complaints of the people they're shepherding. And maybe they had the same thought about, hey, God, would it just be better that you just take my life than keeping me stuck with these complaining people? You know, Moses isn't the only one that did this. If you remember, Elijah, after he asked God to bring fire down and destroyed all the worshipers and the priests of Baal, and God answered his prayers, and he had victory over the priests of Baal. Then he came down from the mountain, and what did he do? He went into the wilderness and started to feel sorry for himself, and he wanted God to kill him. And God sent a raven to feed him, and then he also sent a helper. Elijah was helped by Elisha, God sent Elisha to be an assistant to Elijah, and because Elijah needed help. So Jeremiah told the Lord that he couldn't carry the burden of serving God anymore. This is common, yet God understands that those he calls to serve are just human beings and have their weaknesses as well. Moses lost sight that it was God, not Moses, who provided what his people needed. When the Israelites needed water, God delivered. When they needed nourishment, God provided manna. Moses was right when he said that he was carrying God's people as a nurse carries an infant, because if you look at what the Israelites doing, they're crying like babies. And they were just not mature in the way that they're dealing with their desires and their cravings. But in mercy, God responded to Moses' complaint by setting apart 70 elders to assist him. Elijah was sent Elisha to help him. Moses was sent 70 elders. In verses 16 and 17 of chapter 11 of Numbers, the scriptures say, the Lord said to Moses, bring me 70 of Israel's elders who are known to you as leaders and officials among the people. Have them come to the tent of meeting that they may stand there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take the spirit that is on you and put the spirit on them. They will help you carry the burden of the people so that you will not have to carry it alone. God was basically telling Moses, recruit those that are already called to be leaders and officials of the people. And so he didn't have to train people to be leaders. God had already called them in front of their various clans and tribes. But look what God did. He reaffirmed or re-authenticated Moses' leadership by having the elders come to the tent of the meeting and then speaking to Moses in the presence of these elders. This then reestablished the authority of Moses as the intercessor or intermediary between the 70 elders and God. Now, some scholars say that Moses lost a little bit of the power of the Spirit because he had to split it and share it with the other 70 elders. Most scholars say that no, Moses didn't lose any of the Spirit or the power of the Spirit that God gave him, but God gave the same Spirit to the elders. So the same Spirit that he gave to Moses, he gave to the elders, but this was only a temporary dwelling of the Spirit in the elders. And for a brief time, when the elders received the Spirit of God, they went around prophesying in order to have the people, the community recognize them, that God had blessed them to be in service to the Lord under the authority of Moses. The spiritual gift then that God gave to the elders was manifested by the prophecy, and the prophesying demonstrated that they're being called and set apart by God to assist Moses. Now, not all 70 elders came before the tent of the meeting. 2 remained in the camp. However, God, in his mercy, gave the 2 that did not attend the assembly in the front of the tent of the meeting with Moses, gave them the same Spirit. In verse 26 of chapter 11 of Numbers, the scriptures say, however, 2 men whose name were Eldad and Medad had remained in the camp. They were listed among the elders, but did not go out to the tent. Yet the Spirit also rested on them, and they prophesied in the camp. Jewish tradition is that these 70 elders were a forerunner of the Sanhedrin who ruled over the Jewish people during the time Jesus was, and so this tradition of 70 was carried forward even up to Jesus's time. Now, we're going to look at Moses. Moses demonstrated his humility and meekness of character when Joshua asked Moses to stop these 2 elders that had not gone to the tent of the meeting but still received the Spirit. Joshua started getting jealous for Moses. Joshua feared that Eldad and Medad's prophesying would diminish Moses' authority because they received the Spirit without Moses being present, and that their words would be disruptive because it would cause lack of unity within the camp. But Moses, showing his humility, asked Joshua, "Are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets and that the Lord would put his spirit on them." This kind of reminds me as to the response that Jesus had to his disciples when they returned from going out in the countryside and healing and acting in obedience to Jesus. They came back and said, "Jesus, there are others out there prophesizing and healing in your name." And Jesus says, "As long as they're healing in my name, it glorifies me. I don't have a problem with it," basically. Same kind of response that Moses had. The other, you also remember that Paul was told that he was being criticized by some other people that were spreading the gospel. And Paul, in the same humility, had the same type of response where he said, "As long as Christ is glorified and the gospel is spread, I don't have a problem with my ego or with them trying to criticize me. God's missions are more important than my own status." Now, God showed his grace and mercy to Moses when Moses questioned God's ability to provide enough meat. God complained that he couldn't carry the burden alone. God provided the 70 elders. God complained that he could not provide the meat by himself, and he questioned whether God was able to do so. And he questioned God's ability to provide meat. In expressing doubt, in verses 21 and 22 of chapter 11, Moses told God, "Here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say, I will give them meat to eat for a whole month. Would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them?" Moses was acting like the disciples about, "Jesus, where are you going to get enough food to feed the 5,000? It's the same type of principle, forgetting that God is sovereign and that God is all powerful. And so God's response, I think, is one of the, I think, the most uplifting scriptures of the whole chapter 11. The Lord answered Moses, "Is the Lord's arm too short? You will now see whether or not what I say will come true for you." There's nothing impossible for the Lord. And I like the expression, the Lord's arm is not too short to accomplish anything. So what we have here is 3 days into the wilderness, and already the Israelites are complaining, and their complaints take root so that they no longer trust in God's provisions, his promises, and they lose faith in God, and their complaints become a rejection of their relationship with God. God starts with a warning shot and starts a fire. Moses intercedes, the fire is stopped. Then they complain about not having meat, and that's going to the very nature of one of the blessings God provided to nourish them. And God, in his anger, said, "Okay, you want meat, I'll give you meat, a whole bunch of meat." And their gluttony, their cravings took over, and God sent a plague, which those that were consumed by their gluttony and by their craving for meat, they were consumed and they were buried there in the wilderness. So Moses, when he went to the Lord in his mercy provided help in the 70 elders and showed his power, that his arm was long enough to provide everything that the people needed. And so we conclude the study part of our lesson, but we're going to go into the discussion part. And Paul always likes these parts, the questions that we ask. To maintain faith in God's goodness and trust that God gives us what we need, no more or no less. We cannot let ourselves yield or let our selfish desires or our unbridled emotions override our faith and trust in God. Our cravings for what the world offers or our jealousy with respect to what others have reveal our human nature and weaknesses. We must recognize when our cravings and desires cause us to lose faith in God and in his promises and cause us to reject God's goodness. We must recognize that we are sinning against God himself. So when it takes root and we lose faith and trust in God and we start rejecting God's goodness, even in the difficult challenges we go through, God is good and he desires what's good for us. When we are weak, God is strong. And when we confess our weaknesses to God, God is faithful and merciful to provide what we need to continue to walk in faith to serve him. So we're going to get more of this next week, but this is a progression, and it leads to the entire generation being denied the promised land and God giving that promise to the next generation. It didn't start with 12 men going into the Canaan and coming back with 2 good reports that we can conquer it, and 10 with reports that there's giants and walls and monsters and God can't defeat them. This is a growing contagion that affects this generation.
Amen.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.